Sarah Chen clutched the steering wheel of her beaten Honda Civic as rain pelted the windshield. Her hands trembled not from the cold October night, but from the memory of Marcus standing in her doorway 3 hours ago, his eyes wild with rage and alcohol. The restraining order meant nothing to him. It never had. She had grabbed only what she could carry in 2 minutes: a duffel bag with clothes, her laptop, the small amount of cash she had been secretly saving, and her grandmother's necklace. Everything else remained in the apartment she could never return to. The police had been useless before. They would be useless now. The GPS on her phone had lost signal 20 miles back, somewhere deep in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. Sarah didn't care. Distance was all that mattered. Distance from Marcus, from his friends who watched her every move, from the life that had slowly become a prison over the past 2 years. Her headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating tall pine trees that seemed to lean in toward the narrow mountain road. The fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. She had maybe 30 miles left, and she hadn't seen a gas station in over an hour. Sarah thought about the last time she had felt safe. It was before Marcus, before the charm had worn off and revealed the monster underneath. She remembered her college friend Emma laughing over coffee, warning her about guys who seemed too perfect at first. Sarah wished she had listened. The road curved sharply, and through the trees, she caught a glimpse of something that made her heart leap. A small wooden structure sat about 50 yards off the main road, barely visible through the overgrown brush. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time and civilization. Perfect. Sarah pulled over and grabbed her phone, using its flashlight to examine what appeared to be an old logging road leading toward the cabin. The path was overgrown, but still passable for her small car. She made the decision quickly, turning off the main road and bumping along the rough trail. The cabin materialized in her headlights like something from a fairy tale, though not the pleasant kind. It was small, maybe 2 rooms, with a covered porch that sagged under the weight of fallen branches. The windows were dark, some boarded up with weathered plywood. But it had walls and a roof, and most importantly, it was hidden. Sarah parked behind the cabin, concealing her car from anyone who might pass on the main road. She grabbed her bag and approached the front door cautiously. The wooden steps creaked under her weight, and she winced at every sound. The door was locked, but the wood around the handle was rotted. A hard shove broke it open with a crack that echoed through the quiet forest. Inside, her phone's flashlight revealed a space frozen in time. Dust particles danced in the beam of light. Old furniture sat covered in sheets, and the air smelled of wood rot and something else she couldn't identify. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and filled with the remains of long-dead fires. Sarah found an old oil lamp on a shelf and managed to get it working. The warm glow revealed more details of her temporary sanctuary. Someone had left this place in a hurry. Canned goods still lined shelves in the small kitchen area. A calendar on the wall showed July 1987. Its pages yellowed with age. She explored the single bedroom, finding a bed with a mattress that seemed relatively clean under its dust covering. In the closet, she discovered men's clothing that smelled of mothballs and time. Everything suggested the previous occupant had intended to return but never did. As Sarah settled in for the night, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Solitude without fear. Marcus couldn't find her here. No one could. She was finally truly alone. She tried to sleep, but found herself staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest. Wind moved through the trees with a whispered song. An owl called from somewhere nearby. These were natural sounds, peaceful sounds, not the heavy footsteps in the hallway that had haunted her dreams for so long. The next morning brought weak sunlight filtering through dirty windows. Sarah woke to the sound of rain pattering on the roof. She made coffee using an old percolator she found in the kitchen, burning wood from a pile beside the fireplace. The simple act of making breakfast without looking over her shoulder felt like a luxury. She spent the day exploring her temporary home more thoroughly. In a desk drawer, she found papers belonging to someone named Robert Hensley. The documents were dated from the mid-1980s, mostly bills and correspondence. One letter caught her attention. It was from a bank discussing foreclosure proceedings. That explained why the cabin sat abandoned. Sarah also discovered a radio that still worked. She tuned it to a local station and learned she was somewhere near Mount Hood National Forest. The nearest town was Cascade Locks, about 40 miles away. Remote enough to feel safe, close enough to get supplies if needed. Over the following days, she fell into a routine. She woke with the sun, made coffee, and spent hours walking the surrounding forest. The physical activity helped clear her mind of the trauma Marcus had inflicted. She felt stronger each day, more like the person she had been before him. On her fourth day at the cabin, Sarah decided to venture to Cascade Locks for supplies. She needed food, batteries, and a phone charger. The drive down the mountain revealed spectacular views of the Columbia River Gorge, scenery that reminded her why she had moved to Oregon in the first place. The town was small, maybe 3,000 people, with a single main street lined with antique shops and cafes. Sarah kept her hood up and sunglasses on, even though it was unlikely Marcus would have any connections here. Paranoia had become second nature. At the grocery store, she bought enough food for 2 weeks. The elderly clerk made friendly conversation about the weather, and Sarah realized how much she had missed normal human interaction. Marcus had systematically isolated her from friends and family. Here, she was just another customer buying groceries. She also stopped at a hardware store for batteries and basic supplies. The owner, a weathered man in his 60s, asked if she was camping in the area. Sarah gave a vague answer about wanting to disconnect from technology for a while. He nodded approvingly and recommended a few local hiking trails. Back at the cabin, Sarah felt more settled than she had since leaving her apartment. She was creating a life here, temporary though it might be. She spent evenings reading old paperback novels she had found on a bookshelf, stories of adventure and romance that took her mind off her troubles. On her 7th night, Sarah was reading by lamplight when she heard something that made her blood freeze. The sound of a car engine, growing closer. Headlights swept across the cabin windows, and she quickly extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The engine stopped somewhere near the main road. Sarah crept to a window and peered through a gap in the boards. She could see lights moving through the trees, but couldn't tell how many people or vehicles were out there. Her mind immediately went to the worst possibility. Marcus had found her. She grabbed her car keys and crept toward the back door, ready to run. But the voices she heard through the thin walls stopped her cold. They weren't speaking English. The language sounded European, maybe Italian, and there was something in their tone that suggested this wasn't a casual visit. Sarah remained frozen by the window as the voices grew closer. She counted at least 3 different speakers, all men. They seemed to be arguing about something, their voices rising and falling with obvious tension. One voice was particularly authoritative, cutting through the others with sharp commands. The footsteps stopped at her front door. Sarah held her breath as someone tested the handle, finding it unlocked as she had left it after her return from town. The door opened slowly, and a beam of flashlight cut through the darkness. "Someone's been here recently," a voice said in accented English. "The fireplace is warm." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She was trapped. Her car was behind the cabin, but reaching it would require crossing open ground. If these men were armed, she wouldn't make it 10 feet. "Check the back," another voice ordered. This one carried absolute authority, the kind of voice accustomed to being obeyed without question. "And be careful. We don't know who we're dealing with." Heavy footsteps moved through the cabin, methodically searching each room. Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the bedroom door, hoping the darkness would conceal her. Through the thin walls, she could hear more voices outside. This wasn't just 3 men. This was a group. A flashlight beam swept across the bedroom doorway, missing her by inches. The man attached to it moved on. Checking the closet and under the bed, Sarah realized she was holding her breath and slowly, silently, let it out. "Boss, you need to see this," a voice called from the kitchen. Footsteps moved away from Sarah's hiding spot, and she heard papers rustling. "Hensley," the authoritative voice said thoughtfully. "So this is where the old bastard was hiding." "Looks like he's been gone a long time," another man replied. "But someone's definitely been living here recently. Coffee's still warm on the stove." Sarah's mind raced. These men weren't looking for her specifically. They were looking for someone named Hensley, the previous owner of the cabin. But that didn't mean she was safe. Whatever business these men had with Hensley, it was serious enough to bring them to an abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere. "Search the property," the boss ordered. "If there's someone here, find them. And remember, we need information, not bodies. At least not yet." The casual mention of bodies made Sarah's blood run cold. These weren't just criminals. They were dangerous criminals, the kind who made people disappear. She had fled from one nightmare only to stumble into another. Footsteps moved outside, spreading out to search the surrounding area. Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before they found her car. Once they did, they would know someone was here, and they would tear the cabin apart until they found her. She had to move. Now. Sarah crept toward the bedroom window, hoping it would open silently. The old wood frame protested as she slowly lifted it, but the sound was covered by the voices and movement outside. She managed to open it wide enough to climb through. The drop to the ground was only about 4 feet, but landing silently was crucial. Sarah lowered herself as carefully as possible, her feet finally touching the soft earth behind the cabin. She could hear voices moving around the property, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Her car sat 20 feet away, but the men were between her and escape. She would have to wait for them to move or find another way out. The forest stretched endlessly behind the cabin, dark and full of hiding places. It was her best option. Sarah moved carefully away from the cabin, stepping on soft pine needles to muffle her footsteps. Every few yards she stopped to listen, tracking the voices and lights of her unwanted visitors. They were thorough in their search, professional in their methods. "Found tire tracks," someone called out. "Fresh ones, leading from the road to behind the cabin." Sarah's heart sank. They had found evidence of her presence. It wouldn't be long before they found her car, and then the search would intensify. She moved deeper into the forest, branches catching at her clothes in the darkness. Behind her, she heard more voices, more movement. They had found her Honda and were now actively hunting for her. These men weren't going to give up easily. Whatever their business with the mysterious Hensley, it was worth pursuing into the wilderness. Sarah found herself following what seemed to be an old deer trail, winding deeper into the mountains. She had no idea where it led, but anywhere was better than the cabin. Her feet slipped on wet leaves and branches scratched at her face, but she kept moving. The voices gradually faded behind her, but she didn't slow down. Professional criminals would know how to track someone through the woods. Her only advantage was darkness, and the hope that they didn't know the area well enough to follow effectively. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Sarah stopped to rest against a large tree. Her breathing was ragged, and her legs ached from the unfamiliar terrain. She listened carefully, but heard only the sounds of the forest, wind, rustling leaves, the distant call of a night bird. She was lost in the wilderness, alone, with dangerous men between her and any hope of escape. But she was alive, and for the moment, that was enough. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter against the cold mountain air and tried to figure out what to do next. The cabin that had represented safety was now compromised. Her car was discovered, her hiding place exposed. She had no choice but to keep moving, to find another sanctuary, and to hope that whatever business these men had wouldn't keep them in the area for long. As she sat in the darkness, Sarah couldn't help but think about the cruel irony of her situation. She had fled from one dangerous man only to encounter what appeared to be an entire group of them. The forest around her was vast and unforgiving, but it was also her only protection now. She closed her eyes and tried to center herself, to think clearly about her next move. The men at the cabin were looking for information about someone named Hensley. If she could avoid them until they left, she might be able to return to her car and escape. But if they were planning to stay, she would need to find another way out of these mountains. Either way, Sarah realized her peaceful refuge was over. The real test of her survival was just beginning. Sarah spent the night huddled against the tree, drifting in and out of fitful sleep. Every sound made her jolt awake, certain the men had found her trail. By dawn, her clothes were soaked with dew and her body ached from the cold mountain air. As pale sunlight filtered through the canopy, Sarah could see she was deeper in the forest than she had realized. The deer trail she had followed wound through dense undergrowth, and she could no longer see or hear any signs of the cabin. The silence was both comforting and terrifying. She needed water, food, and shelter, but returning to the cabin seemed impossible. The men might still be there, or they might have left someone to watch for her return. Sarah decided to follow the trail further, hoping it would lead to a stream or another way out of the mountains. The path twisted through ancient pines and moss-covered rocks, clearly used by wildlife for generations. Sarah's stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon. She found some berries that looked familiar from camping trips in her youth, but wasn't confident enough in her identification to risk eating them. After walking for 2 hours, she heard the blessed sound of running water. The trail led to a small creek that bubbled over smooth stones, crystal clear and cold. Sarah knelt and drank deeply, then splashed the icy water on her face. It was the most refreshing thing she had ever tasted. Following the creek downstream, she hoped it would eventually lead to a larger body of water, or possibly even a road. The terrain grew more rugged as she walked, with steep banks and fallen logs creating obstacles. Her city shoes were not made for this kind of hiking, and her feet began to blister. Around noon, exhaustion forced her to rest beside a quiet pool where the creek widened. Sarah removed her shoes and soaked her feet in the cold water, grateful for the relief. She was studying her surroundings, trying to figure out which direction to continue, when she heard voices in the distance. Her blood turned to ice. The men had followed her trail after all. The voices were still far away, but they seemed to be moving in her direction. Sarah quickly put her shoes back on and looked for a hiding place. A cluster of large boulders near the stream offered some concealment. She crawled behind the rocks just as the voices became clearer. There were at least 2 men, and they were definitely tracking someone. Sarah pressed herself against the cold stone and tried to control her breathing as footsteps approached along the creek bank. "Trail gets harder to follow here," one man said in accented English. "Too many animal tracks." "She can't have gone far on foot," replied a voice Sarah recognized as the authoritative one from the night before. "Spread out. Check both sides of the stream." Sarah's heart pounded as she realized they were hunting specifically for her, not just following a random trail. Somehow these men had determined she was a woman and were pursuing her with professional determination. This wasn't a casual search anymore. Footsteps moved closer to her hiding spot. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see a tall man in dark clothing scanning the ground for tracks. He wore expensive-looking boots and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to violence. A radio crackled at his belt. "Boss, this is Chen. Nothing on the north bank. You want us to keep following the water?" Sarah caught her breath at the name. Chen. the same surname as her own, though she was certain this man wasn't related to her Chinese-American family. The coincidence felt ominous. "Keep looking," came the reply through the radio. "She's on foot and scared. She'll make mistakes." The man called Chen moved away from Sarah's hiding spot, continuing downstream. She waited until his footsteps faded before carefully emerging from behind the rocks. The smart thing would be to go upstream, away from the direction the men were searching. But that would take her deeper into the wilderness, further from any hope of rescue. Sarah decided to take a calculated risk. If these men were following the creek downstream, she would climb up to higher ground and try to circle back toward the cabin. Maybe they had left her car unguarded, or perhaps she could find another way down the mountain. The climb was steep and treacherous. Loose rocks shifted under her feet, and more than once she nearly lost her footing entirely. But the exertion warmed her body, and the elevation gave her a better view of the surrounding terrain. In the distance, she could see a column of smoke rising from what must be the cabin. As she worked her way through the forest above the creek, Sarah began to piece together what little she knew about her situation. These men were clearly criminals of some kind, professional enough to track her through the wilderness, but apparently connected to the cabin's previous owner, Robert Hensley. Whatever Hensley had been involved in, it was serious enough to bring dangerous people looking for him years after he had disappeared. Her foot caught on a hidden root, and she tumbled forward, barely catching herself against a tree trunk. The near fall reminded her how vulnerable she was out here. She had no survival gear, limited clothing, and no food. Even if she evaded the men hunting her, the wilderness itself posed serious threats. The sound of engines starting in the distance caught her attention. Through the trees, she could see vehicles moving along what must be the main road. Were the men leaving, or were they repositioning for a wider search? Sarah decided to risk moving closer to find out. She made her way carefully downhill, using trees for cover and stopping frequently to listen. The forest seemed quieter now, as if even the animals sensed the presence of predators. Sarah's nerves were stretched taut, every shadow potentially hiding an enemy. Near the edge of the tree line, she found a position where she could observe the cabin area without being seen. 3 black SUVs were parked along the main road, expensive vehicles that looked out of place in the rural mountain setting. Men moved between the cars and the cabin with military-like efficiency. Sarah counted at least 8 people, all dressed in dark clothing and carrying themselves like professionals. This wasn't a casual, criminal enterprise. These were the kind of people who made problems disappear permanently, and she had stumbled into the middle of whatever they were doing. One figure stood apart from the others, clearly in command. Even from a distance, Sarah could see he carried himself with absolute authority. The other men deferred to him, awaiting orders and reporting back with obvious respect tinged with fear. This was the voice she had heard giving orders the night before, the man they called Boss. As she watched, the boss pulled out a phone and made a call, his voice carried in the still mountain air, though she could only catch fragments of the conversation. He mentioned Hensley's name several times and something about the girl that made Sarah's blood run cold. They definitely knew about her presence, and they were taking it seriously. 2 of the men entered the cabin while others positioned themselves around the perimeter. They were setting up for a long-term operation, not planning to leave anytime soon. Sarah's hope of returning to her car faded as she realized the futility of her situation. The boss ended his phone call and gathered his men around him. Sarah strained to hear their conversation, catching only occasional words carried by the wind. Someone mentioned Seattle, and another voice said something about cleaning up loose ends. None of it sounded promising for her survival. As afternoon wore on, Sarah realized she needed to make a decision. She could continue hiding in the forest, hoping the men would eventually leave. But she was already weakening from lack of food and proper shelter. The mountain nights were cold, and she didn't have gear to survive outdoors indefinitely. Her other option was to try escaping on foot, following the road down the mountain and hoping to reach the town of Cascade Locks. But that meant crossing open ground where she could be easily spotted, and she had no idea how many miles it was to safety. While she debated her options, one of the SUVs started up and pulled away from the group. Sarah watched it disappear down the mountain road, carrying at least 2 of the men with it. Were they leaving for good or just going for supplies? She decided to wait and see what the remaining men would do. The boss and 5 others remained at the cabin. They had brought camping gear and seemed prepared to stay overnight. Sarah's heart sank as she realized this wasn't going to be a quick search. These men were patient and thorough, willing to wait her out. As evening approached, Sarah knew she had to move. Staying in one place too long increased the risk of being found, and she needed to find better shelter before dark. She began working her way around the cabin area, staying well within the tree line but trying to position herself closer to the road. The movement was painfully slow. Every step had to be carefully placed to avoid making noise, and she had to stop frequently to ensure she wasn't being followed. The men at the cabin had posted guards, and she could see the glow of cigarettes in the darkness as they maintained their watch. During one of her rest stops, Sarah heard something that made her freeze in terror. Footsteps were moving through the forest nearby, and they weren't following any animal trail. Someone was hunting systematically through the woods, and they were getting closer to her position. She pressed herself against the trunk of a large pine tree, trying to become invisible in the darkness. A flashlight beam swept back and forth among the trees, probing shadows and checking behind obstacles. The person carrying it was thorough and patient, the kind of search that would eventually find her if she stayed put. The beam passed within feet of her hiding spot, and Sarah could see the man holding it clearly. He was young, maybe in his 20s, but he moved with the confidence of someone experienced in this kind of work. A radio crackled softly at his belt, and he carried what looked like a handgun in his other hand. "Sector 3 clear so far," he reported quietly into his radio. Moving to Sector 4. Sarah waited until his footsteps faded before carefully moving away from her hiding spot. The systematic search meant they were covering the entire area around the cabin. It was only a matter of time before they found her trail or cornered her in a place with no escape. She needed to change tactics. Instead of trying to hide from the search, she would have to actively evade it by staying mobile. Sarah began moving in a wide circle around the cabin, always staying ahead of the search pattern she could hear developing around her. The game of cat and mouse continued through the night. Sarah would find a hiding spot, wait until she heard searchers approaching, then move to a new position. Her pursuers were professional and methodical, but they were covering a large area with limited manpower. By constantly moving, she managed to stay one step ahead of them. By dawn, Sarah was exhausted and running out of options. The search net was tightening, and she was being pushed toward more open terrain where concealment would be impossible. She had also spotted additional vehicles arriving during the night, bringing reinforcements for the hunt. It was during the early morning hours that Sarah made the discovery that changed everything. While evading a search team near the main road, she found something that made her blood run cold. Hidden beneath a tarp behind some trees was a black motorcycle, expensive and obviously well-maintained. But what terrified her were the saddlebags, which bore a distinctive logo, a stylized eagle clutching a banner. Sarah had seen that logo before, in news reports and crime documentaries. It belonged to the Torino crime family, one of the most powerful mafia organizations on the West Coast. These weren't just criminals hunting her, they were members of a family known for their ruthlessness and efficiency in eliminating problems. The realization that she had stumbled into a mafia operation explained everything. The professional search methods, the expensive vehicles, the willingness to spend days hunting for one witness in the wilderness. The Torino family didn't leave loose ends, and she had become exactly that kind of liability. Sarah's hands shook as she backed away from the motorcycle, her mind racing with the implications. Whatever Robert Hensley had been involved in, it was connected to organized crime at the highest levels. And now she was trapped in the middle of it, with some of the most dangerous criminals in the country hunting her through the Oregon mountains. As she crept away from her discovery, Sarah heard voices approaching. Two men were walking toward the hidden motorcycle, speaking in low tones about something they called the cleanup. Their casual discussion of violence made it clear that killing her would be just another job for them, no different from any other task assigned by their bosses. "When we find the girl, make it quick," one of them said. "Boss doesn't want any mess that might draw federal attention." "What about the body?" the other man asked. "Same as Hensley. Deep woods where nobody hikes. Problem solved." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized they had murdered the cabin's previous owner. Robert Hensley hadn't simply abandoned his home and disappeared. He had been killed by these same men, probably for the same reason they now wanted to kill her. He had seen something he shouldn't have seen. She was living on borrowed time. The Torino family didn't forgive, and they didn't forget. Once they decided someone was a threat, that person's life was measured in hours, not days. Sarah had to find a way out of these mountains before they found her, or she would join Robert Hensley as another unsolved disappearance in the Oregon wilderness. The conversation between the two men faded as they moved away, but their words echoed in Sarah's mind. She was no longer just hiding from criminals. She was evading professional killers who had already proven they would murder to protect their secrets. The stakes couldn't be higher, and her chances of survival were dwindling with each passing hour. As morning sunlight filtered through the forest canopy, Sarah realized she needed help. She couldn't escape on her own, not with the Torino family's resources arrayed against her. But getting help meant revealing her location, and any mistake could be fatal. She was trapped between the wilderness and the mob with nowhere to run and no one to trust. The sound of engines starting up caught her attention. Through the trees, she could see movement around the cabin as the search teams prepared for another day of hunting. They had obviously decided she was still in the area and were preparing for a more intensive search. Sarah knew this might be her last day of freedom, and possibly her last day alive. She had to make a choice: continue hiding and hope for a miracle, or take desperate action that might save her life or get her killed in the attempt. Either way, Sarah realized her quiet refuge in the mountains was about to become a battlefield, and she was hopelessly outgunned. Sarah crouched behind a fallen log as the search team spread out from the cabin at first light. She had maybe an hour before they reached her current position, and the net was closing from all sides. Her only chance was to do something completely unexpected, something that would catch the Torino family off guard. She remembered seeing power lines running along the main road during her drive to the cabin. If she could reach them, she might be able to follow them to civilization. But getting to the road meant crossing open ground in daylight, directly through the area where the Mafia soldiers were searching. The sound of breaking branches made her look up. One of the searchers was moving toward her position, methodically checking behind every tree and rock. Sarah could see his face now, a young man with cold eyes and the kind of confidence that came from knowing he held all the advantages. Sarah made her decision. She couldn't outrun trained killers indefinitely, and hiding would only delay the inevitable. Her only chance was to turn the tables somehow, to become the hunter instead of the hunted. But first, she needed to survive the next few minutes. The searcher was close enough now that she could hear his breathing. Sarah picked up a heavy rock and waited. When he stepped around the log that concealed her, she struck with all her strength, hitting him in the temple. He dropped without a sound, his flashlight rolling away into the underbrush. Sarah quickly checked his pockets, finding a radio, a handgun she was afraid to use, and most importantly, a cell phone with signal. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, praying the call would connect. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm trapped in the mountains near Mount Hood by armed men who are trying to kill me. They're members of the Torino crime family. I need help immediately." The dispatcher's tone became urgent. "Ma'am, can you give me your location?" "I don't know exactly. I'm near an abandoned cabin off a logging road, maybe 40 miles from Cascade Locks. There are at least 8 armed men searching for me." "Ma'am, stay on the line. I'm dispatching units to your area immediately. Can you get to safety?" Before Sarah could answer, voices called out nearby. The unconscious man's absence had been noticed, and his radio was crackling with urgent demands for a response. Sarah ended the call and ran, abandoning any attempt at stealth. Speed was her only ally now. Behind her, shouts erupted as the unconscious man was discovered. The organized search pattern dissolved into chaos as multiple voices screamed orders over their radios. Sarah heard the name Marco repeatedly, presumably the man she had struck. She reached the edge of the forest and saw the main road stretching before her like a ribbon of salvation. But crossing it meant exposing herself completely, and she could already hear pursuit crashing through the trees behind her. The power lines she had hoped to follow ran along the opposite side, tantalizingly close but impossibly far. Sarah sprinted across the asphalt, expecting gunfire at any second. She made it to the other side and dove into the brush just as the first pursuers emerged from the forest. Angry voices filled the air, and she heard someone giving orders to seal off the road in both directions. Following the power lines proved easier than she had hoped. A maintenance road ran beneath them, providing a clear path away from the cabin area. Sarah jogged along it, conserving energy but maintaining distance from her pursuers. The sound of engines starting up behind her suggested they were bringing vehicles into the chase. After 20 minutes of steady movement, Sarah heard the most wonderful sound imaginable: sirens in the distance. The 911 call had worked, and law enforcement was responding. But the sirens also prompted increased urgency from her pursuers. Vehicles were racing along the main road, and she could hear helicopters approaching. The maintenance road curved around a hill, and suddenly Sarah could see a roadblock ahead. 2 Oregon State Police cars had positioned themselves across the main road, their emergency lights flashing. Officers in tactical gear were taking positions behind their vehicles, clearly expecting trouble. Behind her, Sarah could hear the Torino soldiers retreating, engines racing as they tried to escape before law enforcement could surround them. But one man was still pursuing her on foot, and he was gaining ground. Sarah looked back to see a figure in dark clothing moving with frightening speed down the maintenance road. She reached the police roadblock just as her pursuer came into view. "That's him!" Sarah screamed, pointing at the approaching figure. "He's one of them!" The state troopers reacted instantly, shouting commands for the man to stop and show his hands. But instead of surrendering, the pursuer pulled a gun and opened fire. The officers dove for cover behind their vehicles and returned fire, the sound of gunshots echoing off the surrounding mountains. Sarah found herself pressed against the side of a police cruiser as bullets flew overhead. The gunfight was brief but intense, ending when the Torino soldier fell to the ground, his weapon skittering across the asphalt. Sirens wailed in the distance as more units arrived to secure the scene. "Ma'am, are you Sarah Chen?" A state trooper appeared beside her, his weapon still drawn but pointed safely away. "Yes, thank God you found me. There are more of them at the cabin. They're armed and extremely dangerous." The trooper spoke rapidly into his radio, coordinating with other units that were already moving toward the cabin location. Sarah learned that her 911 call had triggered a massive response, with federal agents already en route due to her mention of the Torino crime family. As Sarah sat in the back of an ambulance being checked for injuries, she watched law enforcement vehicles stream past toward the cabin. The FBI had taken control of the operation, recognizing it as part of their ongoing investigation into organized crime activities in the Pacific Northwest. Special Agent Rebecca Torres introduced herself as the lead investigator on the Torino family case. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened intently as Sarah recounted everything that had happened since arriving at the cabin. "You've stumbled into something we've been investigating for 2 years," Agent Torres explained. "Robert Hensley was a federal informant who was supposed to testify against the Torino family. He disappeared in 1987, and we suspected he'd been murdered, but we could never prove it." Sarah's blood ran cold. "They mentioned killing him. 2 of them were talking about hiding his body in the deep woods, same as they planned to do with me." "That testimony will be crucial," Torres said grimly. "The Torino family has avoided prosecution for decades because witnesses keep disappearing. You might be the key to finally bringing them down." The cabin area had become a crime scene when Sarah and Agent Torres arrived there later that day. The Mafia soldiers had fled when they heard the sirens, abandoning their vehicles and equipment in their haste to escape. But they had left behind a treasure trove of evidence. Inside the cabin, investigators found documents that confirmed Robert Hensley's identity and his connection to the Torino family. More importantly, they discovered a hidden cache of papers that Hensley had apparently concealed before his death, detailing financial transactions and criminal activities that went to the highest levels of the organization. "Hensley knew they were coming for him," Agent Torres explained as they watched crime scene technicians work. "He hid this evidence hoping someone would eventually find it. In a way, you fulfilled his last wish by leading us here." Sarah's Honda Civic was intact, but had been thoroughly searched. The Torino soldiers had been looking for any clue about her identity or connection to Hensley. Finding none, they had concluded she was simply an unfortunate witness who needed to be eliminated. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself at the center of the largest organized crime prosecution in Oregon's history. Her testimony about the conversations she had overheard, combined with Hensley's hidden documents, provided federal prosecutors with the evidence they needed to bring charges against dozens of Torino family members. The trial process was long and often frightening. Sarah had to enter witness protection temporarily when threats were made against her life, but seeing the men who had hunted her through the forest sitting in federal court, facing life sentences, made every moment of fear worthwhile. Marcus, her abusive ex-boyfriend who had driven her to the mountains in the first place, seemed like a petty criminal compared to the organized killers she had survived. When he was arrested for violating the restraining order, Sarah felt only pity for him. He had been a monster in her personal life, but the Torino family had shown her what real evil looked like. Agent Torres became more than just an investigator. She became a friend and mentor who helped Sarah rebuild her life after the trauma. "You showed incredible courage out there," Torres told her after the trial concluded. "Most people would have been paralyzed by fear, but you fought back." The cabin where Sarah had sought refuge was eventually purchased by the federal government and turned into a training facility for law enforcement. A small plaque was installed near the front door, commemorating Robert Hensley and acknowledging that justice had finally been served. Sarah used her experience to become an advocate for domestic violence survivors, helping other women escape dangerous situations. She often thought about the strange chain of events that had led her from Marcus's apartment to a Mafia hideout in the Oregon mountains. Running from one form of violence had led her directly into another, but it had also given her the strength to survive both. The Torino family's Portland operations were completely dismantled as a result of the evidence Sarah had helped uncover. Dozens of arrests followed, and several high-ranking members received life sentences. The organization never recovered from the blow, effectively ending their influence in the Pacific Northwest. During quiet moments, Sarah sometimes returned to the mountains near the cabin, hiking the trails where she had once fled for her life. The forest held no fear for her anymore. Instead, it represented survival, courage, and the unexpected strength she had found within herself when everything seemed hopeless. She never again underestimated the importance of trusting her instincts. The feeling of unease that had initially driven her to the mountains had ultimately saved her life by removing her from Marcus's influence before he could seriously harm her. And her quick thinking during the crisis with the Torino family had not only ensured her survival, but had brought justice for Robert Hensley and countless other victims. The abandoned cabin stood empty again, but it was no longer a place of secrets and hidden violence. It had become a symbol of justice served and truth revealed. Sometimes hikers would find their way to it, drawn by stories of the dramatic events that had unfolded there. But the forest around it was peaceful now, no longer hiding the darkness that had once made it dangerous. Sarah's life took on new meaning after her ordeal. She met a man named David at a survivor support group, someone who understood trauma and healing. Their relationship grew slowly, built on trust and mutual respect, rather than the manipulation and control that had characterized her relationship with Marcus. When she and David were married 2 years later, Agent Torres attended the wedding. During her speech at the reception, Torres reflected on how Sarah's courage had changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless people who had been terrorized by organized crime. Sarah didn't choose to become a hero, Torres said, but when the moment came, she chose to fight rather than surrender. That choice made all the difference, not just for her, but for everyone who benefited from the justice that followed. Sarah kept in touch with some of the other witnesses from the Torino trial, forming a unique bond with people who had also risked everything to see justice done. They understood the weight of standing up to organized crime, and they supported each other through the ongoing process of healing and moving forward. The mountains of Oregon became a place of pilgrimage for Sarah, a reminder of her own strength and resilience. She and David bought a small cabin near Mount Hood, not far from where her ordeal had begun. But this cabin was filled with love and safety, a sanctuary that represented hope rather than fear. On clear days, Sarah could see the power lines that had guided her to safety during her desperate flight from the Torino soldiers. They served as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a path forward for those brave enough to take it. The scars from her experience never completely faded, but they became symbols of survival rather than sources of pain. Sarah had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite fear. That lesson had saved her life and given her the strength to build something beautiful from the ashes of her trauma. Years later, when young women came to her seeking help escaping violent relationships, Sarah would tell them about the night she drove into the mountains with nothing but hope and determination. She would remind them that sometimes the scariest step forward is also the one that leads to freedom, and that survival is possible even when everything seems hopeless. The story of the abandoned cabin became legendary in law enforcement circles, a reminder of how ordinary citizens could play crucial roles in bringing criminals to justice. Sarah's bravery was recognized with numerous awards, but she always insisted that she had simply done what anyone would do when faced with no other choice. In the end, Sarah's flight from domestic violence had led her not just to safety, but to a purpose that gave meaning to her suffering. She had faced down both personal demons and literal monsters, emerging stronger and more determined than ever. The abandoned cabin had been her refuge, her battlefield, and ultimately, her path to a new life built on courage, justice, and hope. The mountains of Oregon would always hold a special place in her heart, not as a place of terror, but as the location where she had discovered her own unbreakable spirit. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the greatest victories come from the moments when we refuse to be broken, no matter how impossible the odds seem. Her story proved that even in the darkest forests, both literal and metaphorical, there is always a way forward for those brave enough to take the first step.